But today, our guest is Dr. James R. Bartholomew, Professor of History at Ohio State University, where he has taught for his entire career as a professor, certainly a rarity in these days. His lectures on the topic of Japanese science and international politics in the interwar period, the Nobel Candidacies of Hideki Yukawa in physics, and Katsusaburo Yamagiwa in physiology. Today's event is part of the Social Sciences Forum series, and the Asian Studies program would like to thank the forum organizers, as well as several other important co-sponsors, the Human Context of Science and Technology program, with its director, Dr. Joe Tadorevich, the Department of History, my other home, Dr. Kars, Marilyn Kars, and the Office of the Dean, College of Natural and Mathematical Sciences, Dean Bill Kurs. Dr. James Bartholomew received all of his degrees in higher education, from the BA to the PhD, at Stanford University. Also, I think, a rarity in this day. However, during his years as a doctoral candidate, he was very busy. He was a Macy Fellow in the History of Medicine and Biological Sciences in the Department of History of Science at Harvard University, and a Research Fellow in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Tokyo University, Japan's premier institution of higher learning. And as he reminded me earlier today, I'd forgotten this, that around the same time he was also working for Newsweek magazine in Tokyo. How he did all this, I'm not quite sure. But as this might suggest, though, he's a specialist in modern Japanese history, his chief interests lying in the history of science, medicine, higher education, and business in Japan. His 1989 book, The Formation of Science in Japan, received the 1992 Pfizer Award of the History of Science Society and was issued in paperback shortly thereafter. He's produced a long list of articles and book chapters, including a chapter in the Cambridge History of Modern Science, and a large number of articles in really a remarkably wide range of well-respected journals, familiar names such as ISIS, Science, Journal of World History, Journal of Asian Studies, to name a few. His current research on Japan's Nobel Science Prizes has been supported by a number of prestigious awards, including a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship and a 3-year National Science Foundation Fellowship. In 2006, Dr. Bartholomew was selected as a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He has also sat on the board of a number of top academic journals, including the Journal of Asian Studies and the Journal of the History of Science Society. And he has been a visiting fellow at the prestigious School of Historical Studies, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. I could list a number of his other awards for research, but my sketch here alone indicates what an internationally renowned scholar he is. What it does not tell you is that he's also a superb teacher and a recipient of Ohio State University's College of Arts and Sciences Outstanding Teaching Award. I can personally attest to his excellence in the classroom, for I was a student of his at Ohio State for 2 years. And can tell you, I don't think I've told him this, that his lecture notes for his Modern Japan course are the only notes from college that I actually kept after I graduated. And then borrowed from quite liberally when I first began teaching. But I should also tell you that we did not meet at Ohio State. Actually, we met in an elevator, not in the admin building, but at the International House in Tokyo, a hotel and research center for professors and students. I was then a student at Boston University, in Japan on a semester abroad with Colgate University, don't try and understand, and for a variety of reasons did not want to continue my education at either of those institutions. So during the course of that elevator ride, Dr. Bartholomew invited me to attend Ohio State and study with him. And it was fortunate for me that I did. And several years later, I listened to his advice again and applied to Princeton University for the PhD, where I was accepted, no doubt, largely on the basis of his recommendation. So I guess the moral of the story is to be friendly to people on elevators, because you never know whom you may be meeting. Well, this anecdote about serendipity doesn't end there, for in 2003 we discovered we were accidental neighbors, both of us on research leave for a year at the International Center for Japanese Studies in the foothills outside of Kyoto. So during that year, I was able to enjoy his counsel and friendship on a regular basis. And it is fortunate for all of us that he is here today to present his lecture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Bartholomew.
Thank you, Constantine, for that really extraordinary introduction. It was enormously kind. The title maybe requires a comment or two. By politics here, we're really talking about academic politics. However, in the course of studying the Nobel Prizes and Japanese candidates for them, I can also tell you that secular politics have sometimes been involved. If anybody wants to pursue that, we can discuss it, but those particular cases are not the ones I'm going to outline for you this afternoon. No academic today, I think, is surprised to learn that politics can play a role, sometimes a really big role, in the distribution of prizes and other types of professional recognition. Nevertheless, you still meet rather well-educated people who imagine that the Nobel Prizes, at least in science, are never influenced by political considerations. The Nobel Awards have existed for more than a century now, actually 110 years. And their recognition of such figures as Albert Einstein, Max Planck, Robert Koch, long ago established the reputation of the prizes for both intellectual distinction and probity. The large sums of money conferred on winners and the elaborate ceremonies designed to honor them have added, of course, to the prestige of the prizes. The prizes, by the way, will start to be announced this next month. To be sure, the collective achievements of Nobel laureates are themselves the most important reason why the Nobel Prizes continue to command respect among most observers, while also leading some to assume that they lack much of a political dimension. This doesn't mean that all fundamental scientific achievements of the modern era win Nobel Prizes, nor does it mean that each and every prize has represented the best possible decision that could have been made even at the time. Human foibles, prejudices, sheer ignorance are all too real, even in elite professional circles. And prize committees have sometimes made some questionable decisions, one of which I'm going to talk about in a moment. My remarks today reflect my investigation of Japanese scientists who were candidates for the Nobel Prize during the first half of the 20th century. The years between 1901, the first year of the prize, and currently 1962, are the only period for which the Nobel archives in Sweden are open to researchers. And that's because they follow a 50-year rule of access. Why should anybody bother to study the subject of the prizes? There are, I think, several reasons. First, a focus on Japan is an especially good way to illustrate the political aspects of the Nobel Prizes. In its self-presentation, science purports to be fundamentally international beyond secular politics. And the Nobel Prizes embrace that perspective from their inception. At the same time, scientists belong to specific friendship and professional networks. They are citizens of particular nation states, and institutions within those particular nation states are usually their sources of financial support. In addition, scientists, like anybody else, can be very nationalistic. Some people's image of scientists is Albert Einstein, who was very international and cosmopolitan in his outlook, and he was also totally atypical. Einstein's internationalist perspective was unusual even in his day, and certainly even in later times. There is thus an inherent tension between the polarities of friendship or professionalism on the one hand and nationalism or internationalism on the other. This topic of internationalism, nationalism, was the focus of an important book some years ago by Elizabeth Crawford, who was really the Swedish doyen and founder of Nobel studies, which, by the way, have only existed since 1974 when the Swedes reopened the archives. The second reason for my interest in Nobel Prizes has to do with the prestige of scientific achievement in educated circles, in many respects in modern society as such. There are many ways to illustrate that point, including the tendency of opinion leaders in Western society between about 1750 and about 1950 to judge the rest of the world according to whether they, opinion leaders in the West, thought that one or another part of the world had or had not achieved anything significant of a scientific or technical nature. Some of you might recognize this particular phenomenon of judgment criteria as the basis of a book by Michael Addis of Rutgers called Machines as the Measure of Men, which was published in 1989. If it was up to me, I'd make every graduate student have to read that book by Japan's modernization of the Meiji period, that basically the last part of the 1930s, part of the 20th century. Japan's modernization of the Meiji period, one could say, was deeply motivated by a desire to be favorably regarded by Westerners within the framework of this specific viewpoint, that is, foregrounding scientific achievement or the absence of it. This deeply rooted desire to be seen by Europeans and Americans in a certain way, that is, as cultural partners or equals, points to yet a third reason why I decided to study the subject of Nobel Prizes. For some years now, especially since about 1981, when the late Kenichi Fukui was the first Japanese scientist to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry, I had the great privilege to get to know him before he died. A large sector of the Japanese elite has been concerned with Nobel Prizes. Concerned is the right word. How about totally obsessed? All right? And by the way, there's a similar obsession in the People's Republic of China and to some degree also in South Korea. This theme has been, in Japan, that Japanese scientists had or have received too few prizes, and that this reality indicated some degree of prejudice or incomprehension among foreigners, or maybe pointed to a fundamental deficiency in Japanese culture or society. The analysis of this subject within Japan, wherever individuals come down on the matter, has led to a number of countermeasures designed to correct the perceived problem. Not enough Nobel Prizes, we got to do something about this. These countermeasures over the past quarter century have ranged from the reasonable to arguably the absurd. Media attention has been one form of response in Japan to the perceived paucity of Nobel Prizes. There have been some electronic media responses, including videos, but the most visible have been various kinds of print publications, books, especially manga, newspaper and magazine articles dealing with Japanese and foreign scientists, particularly within the context of the prizes. And another response has been an institutionalized form of targeted publicity aimed at people within Japan, featuring Nobel laureates from other countries and from Japan itself. This response has primarily taken the form of the so-called Japan Forum of Nobel Prize recipients. That started in 1987. The forum is still ongoing. It sponsors lectures, conferences, symposia, banquets, photo ops, directly aimed at Japanese university and high school students. The Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper started the forum that Telemi came to enjoy, and the Ministry of Education and Science, and half a dozen or so major private firms in Japan. Up to now, the Nobel Foundation in Stockholm has cooperated with the forum and occasionally participated in its programs. There's, however, a possibility that Swedish Nobel officials will distance themselves from the forum in the future because of more questionable recent initiatives advanced by some people in Japan to raise the prospect of winning more prizes. Counting the first year of the forum, that is 1987, Japanese scientists received 11 Nobel Prizes in the period between 1987 and 2011, and 4 Nobel Prizes earlier, that is 1949 to 86. That's now a total, of course, of 15 Nobel Prizes in science. One of the initiatives directed to winning more prizes has allegedly included appointing a specific official at Japan's Stockholm embassy charged with direct or indirect lobbying of Nobel officials. The Swedes don't like that one. But the most audacious effort to increase the yield of Nobel Prizes by the Japanese was a specific policy declaration of the Japanese government in the year 2000 that over the next half century up to 2050, Japan intends to win 30 more Nobel Prizes in science. This was announced as an official policy intention / declaration. What can you say about this? Radical, unprecedented, brazen. The declaration immediately raised eyebrows. The Swedish secretary of the Nobel Committee for Physics all but said that the Japanese pronouncement had crossed a line even suggesting the possibility of ethical violations. And there was some disapproval within Japan itself about this. A professor in Tokyo University's Faculty of Medicine called the proposal, quote, ridiculous, unquote. Two other recent Japanese Nobel laureates in chemistry, Yoji Noriori and Hideki Yukawa, declared, quote, the Nobel Prize is not in itself something to aim for. If any of you have read James D. Watson and Francis Crick's book, but Watson wrote it called Double Helix, you'll know that this is a specific case where they did aim for the Nobel Prize, and scientists do this all the time, whether they tell you what they know. Even in the scientific community, however, in Japan, not everybody was willing to denounce the proposal about winning 34 prizes in the next half century. In the autumn of 2005, the Japanese government's Comprehensive Science and Technology Committee reviewed the 2000 policy declaration. On this occasion, the chair of the committee, Dr. Hiroyuki Abe, stated, quote, there has been some opposition to this proposal. However, the cabinet finally approved it. It is not a good idea to abandon it after only 5 years, and I do hope, he said, that we can avoid misunderstanding, unquote. Another member of the committee, himself a Nobel laureate in chemistry for 2002, that's Koichi Tanaka, who is not a professor and never was, equivocated on the matter of whether this declaration was a good idea or not. Quote, specifying such a goal does have something to do with research results, but it is difficult to say whether announcing such a precise goal is itself correct or not. In North America or Europe, a proposal of this sort would unanimously be considered fatuous, even ridiculous. Nevertheless, there are very good historical reasons why prominent members of Japan's elite would put forward such a proposal and consider it both serious and reasonable. And I want to turn now to the historical background that provides a context for this kind of proposal. And we'll talk about politics, particularities, and Nobel Prizes. Before World War II, the Nobel system assuredly did not offer a level playing field for scientists in every country. Alfred Nobel, who founded the prizes, created 3 categories in science, to wit, physiology or medicine, that's its official name, chemistry, and physics. His will of 1896 stipulated that the faculty of the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm would determine the winners in the medicine category, while members of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, Kungliga Vetenskapsakademien, would perform the same function in chemistry and in physics. Each of these bodies, therefore, established a prize committee, usually with 5 members, all Swedes, for each of the prizes. In drawing up formal statutes to govern their work, the Karolinska Academy members decided that no more than 3 individuals could ever share a given prize. That wasn't something Nobel specified, it was something that the Swedish committee members decided years ago. Nobel himself had intended that a prize should be awarded to the scientist who had made the, quote, most important scientific discovery in the previous year. This notion, of course, was abandoned as unworkable after the prizes were formally established. I think there's about one example, and only one in the history of the physics prize, where somebody did something and the very next year they got a prize. It never happens. It did happen one or 2 cases. In later years, many conflicts among Swedish committee members and colleagues arose over definitions of exactly what the terms physiology or medicine, in quotes, chemistry or physics should encompass. But I'll leave discussion of these issues aside because none of them appears to have influenced what happened with the Japanese candidates, although we can talk about that if anybody wants to. What definitely did affect Japanese candidates was the nomination system. It's essential to remember that no candidate ever won or could win even today without being formally nominated. That might sound obvious, but it isn't. A single nomination is enough for success, and a large number of nominations will not and has not assured success. Members of the following groups, this is still true, are eligible to nominate candidates: Nobel laureates, members of the various Nobel committees, professors in the relevant fields at Scandinavian universities, and designated others officially asked to nominate by particular Swedish Nobel committees in a given year. So if Stockholm sends you a letter and says, we'd like you to nominate for the Nobel Prize and fill in the field, you get to do it. If you didn't get a letter like that and you weren't one of these other candidates, don't buy to write because nobody will pay attention to what you do. Self-nominations have never been accepted. It's important to note that the Nobel Prizes are a specifically Swedish institution, or one might say Scandinavian in the larger sense. During the first half of the 20th century, all of the members of the committees that determine the winners and the members of the larger bodies that ratify them, Karolinska faculty members, Academy of Science members in Sweden, were exclusively Swedes. To the extent that the opinions in those days of non-Swedish scientists were solicited, except in the context of the letter invitations, this was only done informally and never in an official, formal manner. It's important to note that Nobel committees are not limited in those ways today. A final point. Science was a much smaller enterprise worldwide 1,600 years ago than now. And the universe of Nobel nominations reflected that reality. Whereas before World War II, the Swedes might send out 200 or so nomination request letters and they might get about 50 responses back, in medicine it was more than that. The numbers today are 10 to 15 times what they were a century ago. They send out so many letters now, about 2,000 per category, it's thought. They're not going to overlook somebody the way they once did. Moreover, the entire Nobel enterprise today is much more true than international it once was. By some reports, this is all hearsay, they actually have non-Swedes on the actual committees, or people who have a very central strategic role in the process. That's better for Japan as well. A few words about Japanese Nobel candidates here in the first half of the century. The archives at the Karolinska Institute and the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences showed altogether 17 Japanese were formally proposed for a Nobel Prize during the first half of the 20th century. 17. Of that number, 15 were proposed in physiology or medicine, and 2 in physics. Among the medicine candidates, 2 people were also proposed in chemistry at the Total University of Chemistry in Japan. As these numbers suggest, the Japanese in this period were indeed more active in medicine than they were in other fields. Indeed, if you look at the number of doctorates in technical fields awarded by the Japanese education ministry up through 1921, you'll find that of 1,360 such degrees that were awarded in technical fields, 600 and some were given to people in medicine. The Japanese medical research community had a number of very strong leaders also in those days, some with international reputations. Yamagiwa was by no means the only one. And the research facilities available in Japan for medicine were way better than those for chemistry or physics. And that doesn't change until almost the end of the 1920s. There were, of course, historical reasons for this imbalance. That is, the fact that medicine was very active and well positioned and physical sciences not. And if anybody wants to talk about that, we could. For me, the question was how to select among the 17 nominees from Japan those scientists whose cases might warrant closer scrutiny in the book I read. But in the end, the choice was not actually too difficult. I wanted to select people whose work seemed important. I also wanted to choose individuals for whom there was some source material. And I wanted a group of nominees who were broadly representative of the specialties practiced within the Japanese scientific community. Thus, with one exception, the volume of paper in the archives in Stockholm gave a strong clue as to the relative merits for success of particular nominees. For any historian, if you don't have any source material, you can't write about something, so that's a major limiting consideration. One should note that minutes of the final deliberations by the Swedish decision makers have never been taken. That was by design. However, the reports on the candidates themselves are fairly suggestive as to the final outcome and the reasons for it. Ultimately, I decided to investigate, and in my book we'll talk about 6 Japanese scientists from the physiology or medicine category, 1 from chemistry, and 1 from physics. But only in physics, with the 1949 award to Yukawa, were the Japanese successful during the first half of the century, even though Yukawa is working in a context with hardly any other people of his stature or even close to it. This is ironic in a way because the medical research traditions of Japan in this period were very strong, whereas those in physics were new and not nearly so well established. What I would like to do here this afternoon is to compare the Yukawa candidacy with that of another guy, Katsusaburo Yamagiwa, as it developed in the 1920s. His case was intellectually as compelling in medicine as the later candidacy of Yukawa was in physics. While one should not overemphasize the analytical value of just two case studies, the comparison can suggest, I think, how very different the two prize domains were from one another, and probably still are. And I want to begin with the case of Katsusaburo Yamagiwa, as you can see, born 1863, died 1930. Has anybody heard this guy's name before at all? I want to see a show of hands. That's what I thought. Where whenever we hear that smoking, tobacco consumption causes cancer, we should be reminded of the work of Yamagiwa and his associate Koichi Ichikawa, because they actually founded chemical carcinogenesis as an organized field of study. All subsequent work in the field ultimately derives from what these two did about 100 years ago. All of it. Their great contribution between 1913 and 1921 was to create cancer artificially in the laboratory for the first time in world history by painting coal tar on the epithelial tissue of rabbits' ears. They generated both carcinoma and sarcoma, challenged by skeptical Japanese colleagues who couldn't believe they really did this. They went on to demonstrate metastasis and even succeeded in transplanting the tumors from one animal host to another. This work was seen to prove an influential hypothesis about cancer set forth by Yamagiwa's German teacher, Rudolf Virchow, in the 1860s, to the effect that a so-called chronic irritation of cellular tissue might finally induce tumors. The achievements of Yamagiwa and his associate at Tokyo University, where Yamagiwa was professor of pathology, made him world famous, as well as a leading, if unsuccessful, candidate for the 1926 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine that was awarded controversially to someone else, or let's just say the wrong person, in 1927. When Yamagiwa died rather prematurely in March 1930, Professor William Kramer, an emigre professor of medicine at Washington University in St. Louis, wrote in The Lancet, which is the foremost journal in all of modern English language medicine to this day, the following, quote, said Kramer, "It is impossible to overstate the importance of Yamagiwa's achievement for the study of cancer," unquote. However, some Japanese colleagues not only denied Yamagiwa appropriate recognition for a time, but ridiculed him mercilessly. How'd you like to be called a fool in a major medical journal? And that wasn't the only thing. To understand why recognition was delayed and equally important, why Yamagiwa and Ichikawa managed to succeed, we need to consider the historical and scientific context in which they were working. At least from the late 18th century, there had been a suspicion that certain kinds of chemical exposure might be linked to tumors in people. From 1775, Sir Percival Pott, a physician at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, London, published clinical observation about chimney sweeps, teenagers or young men, who contracted cancer of the skin and scrotal tissue, seemingly as a result of their work, climbing up and down chimneys, get soot all over the body. Pott noted that the tumors that these chimney sweeps would contract rarely appeared while they were actually doing the work, but rather would only become evident in some cases after they had stopped working as chimney sweeps for as long as 10 years. You probably can't see this manga very well, but this is a Japanese manga that actually shows Yamagiwa and Ichikawa doing stuff in their lab. Although Pott made his observations in Britain, which of course is the first nation to undergo industrialization, as the industrialization movement expanded on the European continent, similar reports were published to the effect that workers in certain industries seemed especially prone to cancers of various kinds. But there was never any certainty about this, it's just inference, speculation. So some investigators, ultimately about several dozen, in several European countries from the 1860s on began trying to provide scientific proof of a link between cancer and chemicals. Typically, they approached the problem by subjecting various kinds of lab animals to some regimen of chemical application, painting something on their skin or scarring them, hoping that if they did these things, cancers would ultimately appear. Dogs were prominent among the animal specimens that these early investigators used in the lab setting. None of that worked. Prior to the outbreak of World War I, all of those attempts to create cancer artificially in the lab setting have failed. This is important to know this context to understand why Yamagiwa elicited some of the nasty responses that he did back in Japan. Yamagiwa and Ichikawa succeeded where others had failed for a number of reasons, and one or perhaps more of the factors in their success one could attribute to the particular Japanese social or cultural environment within which they were working. For one thing, they operated as a very effective team. Yamagiwa, following the Birkhoff paradigm, so-called chronic irritation, provided the intellectual framework and research design for the project. But because Yamagiwa had gotten tuberculosis in 1899, some years before they started the project in 1913, he had to follow a very strict regimen of bed rest and could only occasionally appear in the laboratory. This is all before antibiotics. So if you got TB in those days, either you rested, and your body fought it off, or you just died. That was every other possibilities. They couldn't do a damn thing for you. And by the time he died, they did an autopsy. They found that his body had actually overcome the TB, that it affected much of his professional life while he's still working on his project. Ichikawa was 25 years younger, and it was he who had day-to-day control of the actual procedures. It was Ichikawa who applied the coal tar to the rabbits or administered injections or whatever else they did. Years later, when the Tokyo University team had completely succeeded with the coal tar application for generating cancer, people asked Ichikawa, well, how come you were able to do this and all these other people failed? Ichikawa said, well, for one thing, he said, I used ordinary writing brushes used to write kanji characters, and he would cut the brushes off to a very short distance so that he could very carefully control exactly how much coal tar was applied to the rabbit's ears. You couldn't just swab it on and expect that some favorable result was going to be forthcoming. No, it was a very difficult challenge. The choice of a suitable animal host was long controversial among researchers in the field, and that also seems to have mattered. Besides dogs, earlier investigators had used rats or mice. Yamagiwa chose rabbits, partly because rabbits were not susceptible to cancer in the natural environment, and partly also because their long ears provided a convenient source of tar applications to the investigators. But once the Tokyo scientists had proved that tumors could be generated with coal tar, later researchers, even in Japan, usually adopted mice. The reason was that the coal tar could be painted efficiently on the backs of the mice, and because the time required for the tumors to appear was shorter than with rabbits. It took a long time for rabbits. There's still a good reason why they use them. Mice are very sensitive to coal tar, Ichikawa once pointed out. In fact, they're too sensitive, such that if you apply the coal tar to the ears, the site where it's applied will experience necrosis, and the ears would fall off. So then they would start peeing on the mice's back once they knew how to do it properly. Rabbits as animal hosts were sturdier than mice, and more likely the entire procedure could probably only have been demonstrated in the first instance with rabbits. Another factor, however, may have been even more fundamental than the careful procedures of applying coal tar: sheer persistence. Prior to the time of the Tokyo experiments, investigators in Europe had never continued chemical applications to the skins of lab animals for more than 6 months, and most would give up after 2 or 3 months. Oh, you're getting tumors, you can't do it, that's the end of that. By contrast, Yamagiwa and Ichikawa continued their tar applications for 22 months, and depending on how one understands the expression creating cancer, the project could be seen to have lasted about 10 years. Creating cancer is not an entirely straightforward concept. Does it refer only to carcinoma, sarcoma, the appearance of keratomas, metastasis, or what? So challenging was the entire project, and so marked with failure was the path to success. Yamagiwa and Ichikawa faced great skepticism at home and abroad, especially at home, and were forced to expand their efforts well beyond the original parameters. Once their success became widely accepted, some colleagues in Europe offered as an explanation what the Europeans called Japanische Geduld, or Japanese patience. This view, of course, lent credence to a kind of cultural explanation that, however limited or flawed, is not entirely far-fetched. It's also subject to further analysis. Japanese patience in Yamagiwa's case seems to have derived from certain experiences, beliefs, and firm convictions, which in turn reflected more than a little of his samurai background. The Tokyo pathologist was the son of a deeply impoverished samurai family. His father was drunk all the time, died prematurely, accumulated many debts, couldn't work effectively. Yamagiwa decided, I'm going to repay Dad's debts no matter what. He finally did it in 1917 when he was 54 years old. And he did this at a time when his income was the lowest of every single professor in the Faculty of Medicine at Tokyo University. We know that because at the beginning of World War I, the Asahi Shimbun published a series of articles in which they reported the total incomes of every single professor of medicine at Tokyo University. And their point was to say, in wartime, these professors are neglecting their duties to the country. They're just lining their pockets, treating private patients, they're ignoring students in the classroom, and they're not paying attention to their research projects, and on and on and on. Once the war started, Japan was caught totally flat-footed, and somebody has to be blamed, you see, for this catastrophe. Oh, never could it be the politicians, of course not. It was those blank professors. That was, they started unloading on them. So that's anyway why you know this income is so low. As a professor of basic as opposed to clinical medicine, Yamagiwa was forbidden to treat private patients, a pattern that Japanese had borrowed from the German academic system. If you were a professor of, say, orthopedics or dermatology, you could treat private patients, but if you were on the basic side, that is anatomy, pathology, physiology, you could not. The French didn't have that rule, but the Germans did, and the Japanese adopted it from it. Yamagiwa also believed devoutly in the Virchow theory of cancer, expressing thereby an attitude of mere reverence for the views of a European mentor that was rather typical of Japanese academics who studied in Europe during this period of early westernization of science. Colleagues in Japan also described Yamagiwa as possessed of a, quote, iron will, unquote, an archetypal feature of the samurai code of manly behavior. Beyond these traits, the Tokyo cancer pioneer was profoundly impressed by Percival Pott's 18th century observations. Noting the time lag of as much as 10 years between chimney sweeps' exposure to soot in their work environment and the appearance of skin tumors, Yamagiwa was prepared, as nobody in Europe was, if he had to continue those coal tar applications to rabbits for 10 years. 10 years. The Tokyo pathologist Nobel case was a rather convoluted business that I will briefly describe here. By 1921, Yamagiwa's work was officially recognized that the Dutch organized a small conference in Amsterdam that was largely based on Yamagiwa's work. This is unprecedented in world history for Westerners to do something honorary to a Japanese. First time. For reasons of health, TB, Yamagiwa could not go to Amsterdam. Now, about the same time, Gustave Roussy, the eminent Swiss-French pathologist, invited Yamagiwa to travel to Paris in order to attend a conference honoring the centennial birth of Louis Pasteur. Everybody's heard about Louis Pasteur. Yamagiwa could not make that trip either, but the result was that Roussy agreed to invite the younger fellow, Yukawa, to his laboratory in Paris, where the younger Japanese worked for 2 years. A series of 8 papers that Yukawa wrote in French, together with replications of the Japanese work in Paris, Berlin, London, made it patently apparent to everyone in Europe that the results the Japanese had achieved were genuine. In 1924, the eminent German pathologist Ludwig Aschoff of Freiburg University actually traveled all the way to Tokyo and visited Yamagiwa in his laboratory. You want to remember the 1920s, if you go from from Europe to Japan, it's going to take you at least 2 weeks, and that's assuming that the Soviets let you ride on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Deeply impressed by what he, Aschoff, saw in Tokyo, he formally nominated Yamagiwa for the Nobel Prize. Following a path of events too extraneous for full discussion here, the Danish pathologist Johannes P Burger was nominated for the same prize by Aschoff and by others, mostly Scandinavians, by the way, for supposedly generating tumors in the stomachs of rats in a Copenhagen sugar mill by feeding them cockroaches that harbored parasites. This work in Denmark was also taken by some as a proof of the Virchow hypothesis about chronic irritation causing cancer, and it had been published 2 years before Yamagiwa and Ichikawa began their work in September 1913. It's also been noted that when Yamagiwa and Ichikawa published for the first time, they made the mistake of saying, inspired by the glorious achievement of fever. Never do that. When I about that, you got to be careful what you say about the competition. It was crucially important in getting the Nobel Prize that Burger worked in Europe, was well known to European colleagues, and had a lot of fans in Stockholm. There were 2 reports for the Nobel Committee. One favored a shared prize for both Burger and Yamagiwa. The other opposed a prize for either one. The opponent, which by the way was the head of the Karolinska, wrote of Yamagiwa's work that the Tokyo pathologist had, according to the Swedish Nobel official, achieved little more than what he called, quote, the confirmation of a well-known clinical experience. Translation, we always knew chemicals cause cancer, so what? Total misunderstanding of what it meant. Nor did it help that the 2 Swedish referees hated one another. One of them tells you in his autobiography in detail about that. Ultimately, the one favoring the shared prize withdrew his endorsement of Yamagiwa because he discerned correctly that doing so would enhance the prospects for success of his friend Burger. The other referee gave up the fight. So, oh, you want out of these guys? Go ahead, this Danish guy. And so an unshared prize was given to Burger. 6 months after receiving the Nobel Prize, Burger died, and the critics then began opening up on him with both barrels. His work was largely discredited altogether. The Danes, by the way, are very sensitive about this, and so they criticized me in their book for attacking their hero, saying I'm just ahistorical. Yamagiwa was one time a proponent in Stockholm, belatedly means 1964, that I made a big mistake in not continuing to support Yamagiwa all the way along. Far too late, because Yamagiwa has already dead for 50 years. Many years later, 1964, long after World War II, this Swedish referee traveled to Tokyo where he delivered a lecture to an international audience of cancer researchers praising Yamagiwa, but conveniently leaving out the real explanation as to what had happened and why. So a lot of people in Japan think to this day something about Yamagiwa is just totally false. In order to understand that, you have to go to Sweden and read the Swedish letters and documents. Okay. In 1934, I'm talking about Yukawa now. While working as a lecturer at Osaka University, the 26-year-old Hideki Yukawa took up the fundamental question in physics of what it was that held the atomic nucleus together. Consisting, as it did, of protons and neutrons, there was no widely accepted explanation for the obvious stability of the nucleus. Moreover, the arrival of quantum theory seemed for many to imply a fundamental instability in the basic laws of nature associated with classical mechanics, and many physicists found that situation disturbing. Quantum mechanics just really discombobulated some people. Albert Einstein in particular never fully embraced quantum mechanics. Quote, God does not play dice, and quote was a famous comment that Einstein made about quantum mechanics. Thus, while any attempt to answer the question of nuclear forces based on quantum mechanics was certain to attract attention, it also inspired controversy. Yukawa proposed a new theory of nuclear forces that postulated a new sort of quantum, as he put it, intermediate in mass between an electron and a proton. The new sort of quantum or particle was predicted to be intermediate in size between an electron and a proton and would be exchanged by the nucleus, within the nucleus by the nucleons, that is, neutrons and protons collectively. In the words of one specialist, quote, it was known that the electromagnetic field explained the long-range forces between charged particles. Using the idea that a proton and neutron were different states of a nucleon and modifying the electromagnetic field to obtain short-range forces, Yukawa discovered a relation that connected the mass of the field particles with the range of the force between the nucleons. Since the range of the mass was approximately known, Yukawa was able to calculate the mass of these particles to be about 200 times the mass of the electron. That little detail is important. After a lot of debate over some years, the particle was eventually termed the meson, the term we use today. Yukawa stated that mesons would not be emitted in ordinary nuclear transformations, but said that they could possibly materialize in nuclear processes like those that occurred in cosmic ray interactions. I've got my watch on the floor here. Thanks. Too much. In historical context, Yukawa's proposal predicted a nuclear particle, saying to explain something basic, was very original and thus is controversial. Since the early 20th century, physicists have generally embraced H.A. Lorentz's classical electron radius formulation. Later, some people tried to explain the new phenomenon of nuclear physics as a breakdown of existing dynamics, which actually doesn't tell you anything, rather than accept the existence of new particles or forces. Among the prominent critics of Yukawa was Niels Bohr, leader of the highly influential Copenhagen School. Notice Copenhagen. I only thought of that for the first time this week. In 1937, Bohr accepted a long-standing invitation to visit Japan. This invitation was not organized by Yukawa, somebody else, usually. A famous anecdote shown in the manga tells of Yukawa's summertime visit to Bohr at his, that is Bohr's Japanese inn, Ryokan, in Kyoto. Now we all have to keep in mind what the weather's like in Kyoto in the middle of the summer. In the manga, you see it. Yukawa is wearing a business suit. It's probably about 90 degrees outside. And kneels like a suppliant on the tatami mat in front of Bohr, who's sitting in this nice wicker chair, puffing away on his pipe. And so Yukawa is there really to explain his meson theory, particle exchange. Bohr responds merely by saying, this is it. So, like new particles. Yukawa, of course, felt totally deflated. He was hoping for more response than that. What Bohr was really thinking was, this is all just totally wrong. I can't believe any of it. But he doesn't say it quite like that. After Yukawa explained his theory, of course, Bohr gives him this negative response. Later, critics of Yukawa, like Enrico Fermi, active in the Manhattan Project for the Atomic Bomb, and Robert A. Millikan, one of the founders of Caltech, would later invoke the authority of Bohr in urging that Yukawa be denied the Nobel Prize that he nonetheless finally received in 1949. Now with Fermi, as we'll see, he had his own proposal about the nucleus and the reasons for its stability. Bohr is sort of judging from the outside. As for Millikan, Millikan was never reconciled for Yukawa, and he did his best to prevent the Nobel Prize for Yukawa. You can read the documents, letters that Bohr wrote, and ask yourself whether he stepped over a line or not. He criticized Yukawa. Yukawa's path to Nobel Prize was rather circuitous, although it showed that formal scrutiny and professional deliberations worked a bit differently in physics than they did in medicine. Ignored for the first 2 years after its publication in 1935, Yukawa's proposal suddenly attracted attention when two Caltech physicists, who had previously been unaware of Yukawa's work, discovered a new particle while conducting a cloud chamber experiment on Pikes Peak, Colorado. These were Seth Niedermeyer and Carl Anderson, who already had the prize. The new particle was shown to have a mass between that of an electron and a proton, calculated to be somewhere between 130 and 240 times the mass of an electron. It seemed, the particle that Niedermeyer and Anderson had found in Pikes Peak, Colorado, seemed to be a strong candidate for the exchange particle that Yukawa had predicted. So from this point, Yukawa's work kind of enters the spotlight. Yukawa himself gets attention. 1938, 1939, Yukawa is invited to the famous Solvay conference. That's the summum bonum of recognition, short of the Nobel Prize among physicists in those days. And so he goes to Europe to attend this conference, leaving Japan for the very first time. Well, the conference was canceled because Adolf Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, September 1st. Yukawa stayed longer in Europe, where he gave seminars in Germany and Switzerland. Yukawa then returned to Japan by way of the United States. And a crucially important note, in Pasadena, California, Yukawa had dinner with Anderson and Niedermeyer, found the particle. But R.A. Millikan was away in Australia studying cosmic rays and did not meet Yukawa. Would it have made a difference if he had met Yukawa? Interesting speculation, we'll never know, of course. But considering the animosity that Millikan had toward Yukawa, I doubt it. we'll never know. As cosmic ray studies and theoretical formulations accumulated, it gradually became clear that the Anderson-Mittermeier particle was not the one that Yukawa had predicted. Their particle, which was later termed the mu meson or muon, did not participate in the strong nuclear force and was found to decay with a mean life of 2.2 microseconds, which is much too long for the expected lifetime of Yukawa. World War II diverted scientists away from attention to certain areas of nuclear physics, such as what accounted for the stability of the nucleus. But when investigations resumed after World War II, new findings began to point away from the significance of the Yukawa theory, even though Yukawa had modified the theory along the way. Especially significant in that regard was the work of 3 Italian physicists on meson absorption that was published in early 1947, which for a time was considered a, quote, stunning blow, unquote, to the Yukawa theory of mesons. What finally changed the balance of evidence in Yukawa's favor was the discovery of the pi meson, or pion, in Bristol, England by Cecil Powell and his co-worker Giuseppe Ocellini. Between 1939 and 1945, these two experimentalists had developed a new apparatus for tracking the particles tracking particles found in our cosmic radiation. Their photographic emulsion device made possible the discovery of the pi meson, or pion. And it was then shown that the muons of Mittermeier and Anderson were the decay product of Yukawa's pions. The pions had not been detectable by older methods for tracking particles, cloud chambers, because of their short lifetimes and propensity to decay in flight. The Bristol triumph of 1947, late 47, set the stage for 2 Nobel Prizes, one for Yukawa in 49 and one for Powell in 1950. In the light of Japanese experience with Nobel nominations in medicine, as illustrated by Yamagiwa's case, it's interesting to observe that the pattern of Yukawa's Nobel nominations conformed in notable degree to the sequence of events just described. That is, nominations for Yukawa arrived in Stockholm when the empirical evidence and theory were favorable and mostly dropped off or were not forthcoming when the opposite conditions existed. The earliest nominations came from 2 colleagues in Japan, as you can see here, Nago Kantaro and Matsumoto Toru, as well as from the Dutch physicist Dirk Koster. Equally notable, however, the nominations from Louis de Broglie and also his brother Maurice, and a number of other physicists from France. The de Broglie recommendation in particular attracted my attention, notice 1943 and 44, because de Broglie and Yukawa had never met, also because de Broglie himself was a Nobel laureate, and C, because in 1960, de Broglie arranged for Yukawa to receive an honorary doctorate from the University of Paris, where he, de Broglie, was a professor. One could not ascertain the reasons for de Broglie's enthusiasm for Yukawa on the basis of the nomination letters that he wrote to Stockholm, 1943 and 44. Because all de Broglie said to the Nobel authorities was, oh, give it to that Japanese physicist Yukawa. That's the whole content of the letter. That doesn't tell you anything. And so I thought to myself, what is behind all this? So I was just curious beyond words. So I went to Paris to look for the answer, and to my astonishment, I actually found the answer. During World War II, while the Nazis were occupying Paris, de Broglie gave a series of lectures at the Institut Henri Poincaré. One of them was entitled, quote, Théorie de Meson, parentheses, Hideki Yukawa, close parentheses. De Broglie wrote out the lecture in pencil, and the text can be found in the archives of the Académie des Sciences in the Institut. In de Broglie's lecture notes, they revealed the attraction of Yukawa's work for de Broglie, who had studied the theory of light. De Broglie wrote, quote, the interaction of 2 nucleons as proposed by Yukawa operates by a virtual exchange of mesons, just as the Coulomb interaction between 2 charged particles can be interpreted as a virtual exchange of photons. Then, referring to Yukawa's 1938 theory of the vector as opposed to the scale of meson, de Broglie wrote that the Yukawa theory, quote, essentially relies on the equations proposed by Mr. Alexander Proca in 1936, which in the absence of a nuclear field can lead to the equations that I have been brought to envision in the theory of photons. Translation, the French Nobel laureate was highly impressed by Yukawa in terms of the structural nature of the theory, so that there was a fundamental symmetry between De Broglie's theory of light and Yukawa's theory of essence. Okay? At the moment, I don't know enough to comment intelligently or at all on the perceived reasons for other nominators' support of Yukawa, although I've tried to find out why all these MIT people came forward and proposed Yukawa. We had a certain hypothesis about that, none of which could be proven by the archival materials in Cambridge. But it is clear that the International Physics Committee was generally being cautious in the mid-1940s. For instance, in 1945, November, Ivar Waller, professor of physics at the University of Uppsala and a member of the Nobel Committee for Physics, wrote, quote, "It does not seem to me that any certain judgment about the significance of Yukawa's prediction of meson can be given at present," non quote. Now, two prominent figures, Marcel Schein and Gregor Wenzel, do come forward to propose Yukawa here in late 47 and early 48. Whether at that time they knew about the findings in Bristol is unclear. I think I will find the answer to that, but I haven't done so yet. But the dam on nominations breaks more definitively in 1949 with letters to Stockholm by two Nobel laureates, that is to say Theodore Stedberg and Otto Stern, as well as a whole host of people from MIT and a scattering of other physicists as well. And this definitely was influenced by the Bristol findings. So what kind of conclusions one might offer about all of this? I thought, well, eventually, the first thing I'm going to try and write out some conclusions, and then I started writing some stuff down. I thought, so I'm just going to give you some seat of the pants guesstimates here. One thing that's very obvious, and that is medicine is very different from physics. It's never easy to get a Nobel Prize in any field at all, but in medicine, it's just like really hard. Why? Too much competition. You ask yourself, for the purposes of determining prizes, what does the domain of medicine encompass? And the answer is everything from soup to nuts. Physics, even, is broad enough, but over the years, the Swedish committees decided, well, we're going to limit physics in this way and that way. They cut out astronomy for a long time, no geophysics either. Now they decided, well, those are okay, we'll consider them as well. But, and again, chemistry, it's not a trivial exercise to ask yourself, for the purpose of awarding a prize, what constitutes the domain over which we have some responsibility in determining accolades. Yamagiwa, in particular, in medicine, in the 1920s is up against what can only be described as Scandinavian shoulder. I think I'm going to pull my punches on that a little bit in the publication, but maybe not. Frankly, I mean, the Fevergert nominees, some of them twisted the facts, they misstated the evidence, they were so partisan, you just say, I can't believe this is happening. But hey, scientists are human beings too. What's surprising about that? Nothing. But here's a key point. Physics relies and has for a very, very long time on math. Medicine makes more use of math as time goes on. But it is not, at least historically, a mathematics-based discipline in the way that physics is. The more math, the more the cultural dimension of approbation or judgment is minimized. The math is either right or it's wrong. And if it's right and it fits the empirical observations as the Bristol experiments provided, then by golly, the physics community said, we're going to go ahead with this, and we don't know this guy Yukawa, we don't know anything about him. It doesn't work like that in medicine, or at least it sure didn't historically. Are things different today? Who knows? You can't see any archival stuff until after 50 years have passed. The one thing that I can say, and I'll stop with this, nowadays the Swedes try really, really, really hard not to miss anybody. They send out so many letters, it doesn't matter whether you're a Scandinavian university professor or some such. If you did something notable, maybe somebody's going to nominate you. But here's another point that's easily overlooked. People don't like you. They're not going to nominate you for a Nobel Prize. Some people have always wondered why Dr. Jonas Salk didn't get a Nobel Prize for the polio stuff. And some people said because nobody liked him. Okay, I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much. Perhaps you'd like to take some questions from the floor? Sure. I thought you did.
If I don't know, I'll just tell you.
Could you just explain the title you had up there
Yeah.
about Buddha,
Yeah.
Buddhism and quantum physics?
Yeah, I was actually going to talk more about that, but, I couldn't cover everything. An important point about Yukawa in this context, that is, of meson particle theory investigation, is the following. People like Einstein, who are born and raised in Europe, they expect a certain kind of stability in nature. And so nature supposedly operates by certain fundamental unchanging rules, et cetera, et cetera. Yukawa just wasn't troubled by that. For him, flux, instability, constant change, this is all part of the Buddhist cosmological perspective. There's an interesting point in Yukawa's early career when he's deliberating between, well, do I want to go into science or do I want to become a Buddhist priest? He darn near became a Buddhist priest, in which case we never had this Nobel Prize or anything else. So that's as much as one can tell. Now, here's another thing I want to emphasize. Anybody who does history of science knows that there is a substantial literature on the impact of religion, Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism, et cetera, on people's work in science. Has that inquiry been done with respect to people in China or Japan? Not to my knowledge. People just make gratuitous assumptions about it. We actually need some serious consideration of this. It's not irrelevant to notice that Yukawa comes out of a Buddhist/Taoist context, and he's interested in science. And so what about other Japanese who also, are active in science? Does this matter? And the response has got to be, of course it matters at some level. We just don't know enough about it to say much.
Well, I noticed on your list, actually, could you go back to the slide before during the award?
Right here?
There are a number of nominations, obviously during World War II, which struck me as remarkable. One that science could overlook
Well,
the conflict. Any
they
comments on
did, and they did. What happened was that once the war was fully enjoined, the Nobel stuff just kind of shut down in terms of their deciding, let's give something to A and to B and so on. And they did that for 3 years. And finally, in 1944, they came up against it because the original charter specified that if the prizes weren't awarded for the 3 years, the money might just evaporate in thin air. So then they went to heroic lengths to choose winners for those years. But people did not travel to Stockholm in 1944 and get an award from the King of Sweden. No. Go ahead. Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask about the manga.
Okay.
Are they contemporary? Are they depicting that later on? I mean, it's amazing that it's depicting these particular moments.
I know.
And then if you have a minute, if you could say something about China.
Yeah,
And
okay.
the idea
Yeah.
that China also has this sense that they've been overlooked by the West.
Absolutely. On the matter of the manga, how long have the Japanese been publishing manga about scientists? Boy, I'd say at least 15 years. It might be longer than that. I haven't made a systematic study. But there are whole books of manga that will tell you about the life of Einstein, of Newton, of Yukawa, of Tonegawa, who's still living, and various other figures. And people, we know that manga are enormously popular in Japan, and now they're becoming increasingly popular elsewhere. The amount of what you might call cartoon-like literature in English dealing with scientists is just really, really thin. There's a wonderful one that was done about 25 years ago that shows the saga of Lisa Meitner getting out of Nazified Berlin just in the nick of time before the Gestapo arrested her for being Jewish and getting into the Netherlands. It's a marvelous manga, but I don't know of any others like that in English. And so, but in Japanese, you have all this wonderful stuff. With respect to China, in the first half of the 20th century, there was a little bit of action with the Chinese. There was a very famous plague researcher named Li. Just a minute. Qian. No, Wu is another. Hold on. If you send me an email, I'll tell you the name. That's fine. Yeah. I want to say Wu Lian. That's not quite right. But anyway, he was at Peking University Medical School, and he was very prominent. There's actually a biography of him in English, interestingly enough. And he was nominated by somebody who was British but based in Hong Kong for the Nobel Prize. And then there was one nominator selected from China, which is the Wu Xian, who later was a professor at Cornell in the United States. That's it for action with respect to China. An obvious question is, given that China has produced many talented people in every field of endeavor, including, by the way, physics and chemistry, what's ever happened with the Nobel Candidacies? And the answer is, these people went abroad, and most, 99% of the time, did all their work abroad. For instance, the first Nobel laureates from China, Li Tsung-Dao and Yang Qianning, they were at the University of Chicago with Fermi. And they made their careers here. Later on, Zhou Enlai tried to get Yang Qianning to relocate to China, but he said, no, I'm not going to do it. But he agreed to come every year and advise the Chinese about science policy and such. There is a big push now in PRC to win Nobel Prize for work done in China. The closest they are believed to have come was in 1964, when a team of biochemists in Shanghai synthesized bovine insulin. That was a very major achievement. And we know that the Swedes looked into it. Those archives are not yet open. But they did, and according to some reports, the Chinese couldn't agree on, well, who was the main figure, the main three people, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was the end of that. This is a hypothesis. We don't know that for certain, but it might have been like that. So China's had, major talent, of course, which is one of these big-time accolades, but not yet for work done in China. That's going to change for sure. In 2007, a three-member Swedish team of scientists went to China and went around and gave lectures, just like the Nobel Forum thing in Japan. And so some student in, I'm not sure which Chinese city, said to them, well, what about, Chinese recipients of the Nobel Prize? And one of the Swedish guys says, well, we're hoping that in the future, people in China will be a little bit lazy. He said, otherwise, they'll win all the Nobel Prizes and there won't be any for the Swedes. And of course, everybody laughed. Now, there are a number of things about that story that are kind of interesting. First of all, you can't imagine that they would go to Japan and say that. But China, it's sort of believable because China is this really big country and it has a great large scientific enterprise nowadays. We can be sure that eventually China's going to get one or more Nobel Prizes, and it might get to the point where China will win a really large share of them because such an enormous effort of talent deployment, etc.
You also mentioned South Korea.
Yeah, a few years ago there was a very interesting case where somebody in Seoul National University, I should remember this case really well, claimed to have done something really important, and if it had been true, it would have been a surefire Nobel. But it then was proven to work fraudulent, and that was a great embarrassment for Korea. It was too bad. Korea came kind of late, to modern science because colonialism. There were actually Koreans in the 20s and 30s who went to do graduate work in Japanese universities and got started on a scientific career. And there's some literature now on comparing North Korea with South Korea in terms of activity by scientists and so on. But Korea's small and Japan and China are bigger. And so what does that mean? Will Korea eventually get something? No doubt they will. Yeah.
So maybe other than the countries that you mentioned in Asia that think they're being discriminated against in the Nobel Prize process, are there other countries in other regions of the world that have that same perspective?
That's a fair question. I don't know the answer to that. Argentina has won 3 Nobel Prizes for work done in Argentina. Well, most of them are Argentina. Brazil hasn't yet won a Nobel Prize. A Brazilian won, but as part of the English-speaking ambit. Venezuela, same deal. Is there a fixation with Nobel Prizes in those countries? I've not heard about it. I kind of doubt it, but there could be a growing interest. Brazil is a big-time, major country now in terms of manufacturing and all kinds of things. So it wouldn't surprise me if there were elites in Brazil who were saying, well, one of these days, we should get something. South Africa has won a Nobel Prize for work done there. India, many people don't know this perhaps, India has won a Nobel Prize. In fact, the first country in Asia to win a Nobel Prize was Chandrasekhar Venkata Raman in 1930. That was an unshared Nobel Prize, and it's the only case I know of where Raman did something really important. He discovered something called the Raman effect, which is very important in spectroscopic analysis of physics. You want to know the constituents of a particular element or something like that, you can ascertain that with his techniques. Anyway, he published this stuff, and by golly, the very next year, a whole bunch of major figures jumped on the wagon and said, we got to recognize Raman. And so he got it. And then his nephew, Chandrasekhar, got a Nobel Prize later, but he was working in the USA. That's it for India up to now. Pakistan's also.
Why don't we then continue the conversation over some light refreshments in the back of the room, and please join me in thanking Dr. Bartholomew.